Sit back, relax, and imagine the streets of colonial Boston in the early 18th century, where the air smells faintly of wood smoke and the river carries the whispers of merchants and sailors. It is January of 1706, and a boy is born into a world that is rigid, structured, and filled with expectation. Benjamin Franklin, the 15th of 17 children, arrives in modest circumstances, the son of a candlemaker. The world around him is loud with the clatter of trade, the rhythm of horses on cobblestones, and the endless turning of presses in the print shops that line the narrow streets. Some researchers suggest that from an early age, Franklin felt the tension between limitation and possibility, between the constraints of poverty and the expansive promise of knowledge. He devours books with a hunger that seems almost unnatural. For a child of his station, sneaking pages by candlelight, tasting new worlds with every line. Others believe his curiosity was innate, a spark that could not be extinguished by circumstance. The streets themselves seemed alive with lessons, each passerby a teacher, each market stall a library of human behavior. He learns to observe, to mimic, to understand, long before he can articulate the principles that will later guide his life. The clamor of Boston becomes a symphony of learning, each sound, each texture, embedding itself into his young mind. It is here, amidst the dust of candle wax and the smell of fresh ink, that the foundation of a revolutionary life is laid. A boy who knows no one will remember his name beyond these narrow streets already begins to think in ways that challenge convention, ways that whisper of something larger, something unseen. The rhythm of his early life is simple but profound, punctuated by chores, books, and fleeting moments of freedom in the small courtyard behind his home. But the question lingers even now. How does a boy, born into ordinary circumstances, grow into a man whose name would one day adorn coins, monuments, and the collective memory of a nation? This is the question that will guide us as we trace the life of Benjamin Franklin, a journey that stretches from the shadows of a small colonial street to the grand salons of Paris, and finally into the very heart of a newborn nation. And as we begin, we must ask, what was it in Franklin that made the ordinary extraordinary, that allowed one life to bend history itself? From the quiet, candlelit corners of his home, we move into the bustling, clanging world of a colonial print shop, where ink stains fingers and the air is heavy with the acrid scent of hotite. At the age of 12, Benjamin Franklin begins his apprenticeship with his brother James, a man both strict and impatient, whose temper is as sharp as the press itself. The shop is a universe of its own, the rhythmic pounding of the platen, the hiss of hot ink on paper, the smell of fresh sheets stacked high like fragile towers. Franklin, small and wiry, moves among these machines with a combination of curiosity and precision, learning to set type, mix ink, and fold paper. Some scholars suggest this period shaped not only his skill with the written word, but his understanding of human nature. For the print shop is more than a place of labor, is a theater of personalities. He observes arguments, rivalries, whispered gossip, the unspoken hierarchies that govern even the simplest interactions. Others argue it was the books smuggled from the shelves, the essays and pamphlets that whisper revolutionary ideas that truly molded him. Franklin begins to write under a pseudonym, Silence Dogood, and his essays, witty and sharp, circulate secretly, causing laughter, intrigue, and sometimes ire among Boston's literate circles. he discovers the power of words, the way ideas can ripple outward and shape perception, influence thought, and quietly bend the world. At the same time, the city outside the shop grows restless. Voices murmuring against authority, ideas of freedom and self-determination beginning to stir in the minds of its inhabitants. The boundaries of Franklin's small world are expanding rapidly, and yet the shop remains a crucible, its heat and ink a forge for the intellect. He learns to negotiate, to charm, to maneuver within the strict confines of apprenticeship while cultivating his own voice, a voice that will one day speak across oceans. Each clatter of the press, each folded sheet, feels like a note in a symphony of potential. And yet, even as Franklin hones these skills, there is an undercurrent of restlessness, a sense that this is not the world he was born to inhabit. A horizon beyond Boston beckons, faint but persistent. He will leave this place, not with rebellion in mind, but with ambition and curiosity, carrying with him the lessons of ink, observation, and human behavior. The question lingers: what drives a young boy to step into the unknown, to risk comfort for possibility? And how does that first spark of ambition grow into the force that will one day challenge kings and empires? The night air carries the smell of sea salt and the distant hum of horse-drawn carts as Benjamin Franklin, barely 17, slips away from Boston, leaving behind the oppressive weight of apprenticeship and the shadow of his older brother. He walks the streets quietly, avoiding the lantern-lit gaze of neighbors, every step a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Some researchers suggest it was a thirst for freedom. Others insist it was a longing for opportunity, but whatever the motive, Franklin moves with the cautious determination of a man already imagining a life larger than the narrow streets of his youth. He boards a ship bound for New York, the wooden vessel creaking under the sway of waves, ropes snapping softly in the wind, the sails snapping like distant thunder. The sea is both friend and adversary. The cold stings his face, the rocking of the ship lulls and unsettles him in equal measure. In New York, he moves among strangers, a boy among men, taking odd jobs, printing handbills, delivering messages, his small frame blending into the crowd even as his mind races with ideas, observations, and dreams. The streets are alive with commerce and conversation, scents of baking bread mingling with the smoke of open fires, the chatter of merchants and sailors forming a constant, hypnotic rhythm. He learns quickly that the world is not governed by merit alone, but by wit, perseverance, and the subtle understanding of human motives. Soon he continues to Philadelphia, a city perched on the river, bustling, growing, yet still young, still unformed. Much like Franklin himself, here he finds a new print shop, and with it new lessons and challenges, yet a sense of possibility that Boston could never offer. Some suggest it is in this city that Franklin first glimpses the potential of America itself, the raw energy of a land on the verge of transformation, where ideas can take root in fertile soil. Others hint at a loneliness beneath the excitement. A boy still untethered from family and home, yet strangely invigorated by the anonymity and freedom the city provides. Each street corner, each market, each echoing hall of commerce becomes a classroom, teaching him as much about survival and ingenuity as any book ever could. And within him, a quiet determination grows, a sense that he will not merely participate in the world, he will shape it. As he walks along the riverbanks at dusk, watching the orange light shiver on the water, one cannot help but wonder, how does a boy, armed with little more than ink, curiosity, and ambition, become a force capable of changing the course of nations? What unseen strands are beginning to weave the tapestry of a life that will one day leave an indelible mark on the world? Philadelphia in the early 1720s was a city of narrow cobblestone streets, wooden row houses leaning precariously toward one another, smoke curling from chimneys into a grey sky that carried both promise and soot. Here, Benjamin Franklin found his place in a small print shop, the rhythmic pounding of the press echoing like a heartbeat through the room. Ink-stained fingers and the sharp, acrid scent of molten lead filling the air. He worked tirelessly, apprenticed under the strict eye of a master, learning the craft of letters, typefaces, and layout, each page a lesson in precision and patience. Some researchers believe Franklin's genius was forged in these hours of repetitive labor. Others suggest it was the constant exposure to the ideas that flowed through printed words, the pamphlets, broadsides, and essays that carried news, gossip, and revolutionary thought across the colonies. He was a keen observer of human nature, noticing how words could persuade, charm, or provoke anger, and he began to experiment quietly, inserting small aphorisms and witty commentary into printed material, testing the reactions of readers who would never know the author. The city around him was alive, filled with the chatter of merchants, the clatter of wagons, the cries of street hawkers, each sound a note in the symphony of urban life that Franklin absorbed, catalogued, and reflected upon. Beyond the print shop, he wandered libraries and coffee houses, inhaling the scent of parchment and pipe smoke, engaging in debates with strangers, absorbing science, philosophy, and the faint murmur of political unrest. He observed the disparities of wealth and the inequalities of colonial society, storing these impressions like seeds for future growth. By his 20s, Franklin was no longer merely a printer. He was a publisher, an entrepreneur, a man beginning to shape public opinion. He launched his own newspaper, taking risks that could ruin him financially, but offered him freedom to express his ideas. Some historians suggest it was his curiosity and ambition that drove him. Others believe it was a restless desire to carve a new identity, free from the confines of apprenticeship and family expectation. Through this period, the foundations of Franklin's life were being laid. A relentless work ethic, a fascination with knowledge in all its forms, and an understanding that influence could be wielded as effectively through the written word as through force. And yet, amid the ink and the press, a larger story was quietly forming, a story of a man who had moved beyond Philadelphia, beyond the colonies, to stand at the intersection of science, diplomacy, and revolution. One cannot help but ask, how did these modest beginnings, in the dim glow of candlelight and the scent of wet ink, ignite the spark of a life destined to alter the course of history? Asterisks in the dimly lit rooms of his Philadelphia print shop, Benjamin Franklin crafted something far more enduring than newspapers or pamphlets. He created a mirror of society, a reflection of the hopes, fears, and everyday wisdom of the colonial world, wrapped in the guise of a simple almanac. Poor Richard's Almanac, first published in 1732 under the pseudonym Richard Saunders, became a phenomenon, its pages filled with calendars, weather predictions, practical advice, and aphorisms that seemed to distill the essence of life into sharp, memorable lines. Some scholars suggest Franklin's almanac was more than just a tool for daily planning. It was a subtle form of social engineering, shaping thought, manners, and the moral compass of its readers. Others argue that its charm lay in its accessibility, in the way it spoke to ordinary people in the rhythm of everyday speech, blending wit, humor, and practical counsel. Each year, Franklin introduced new sayings, crafting them with care, testing them in conversation, in letters, and in print, refining the art of brevity so that each line carried weight far beyond its few words. He encouraged thrift industry, honesty, and humility, yet never in a preachy tone, instead wrapping lessons in playful irony and gentle mockery. The almanac sold thousands of copies, reaching far beyond Philadelphia, carried by traveling merchants and sailors, its words whispering through kitchens, workshops, and taverns, shaping the ethos of a growing nation. It was here that Franklin's duality became apparent. The pragmatist and the philosopher, the humorist and the moralist, the observer of human folly who sought to improve it. He understood the pulse of society, and he could speak to it, not from a podium, but from the printed page, from the intimate space of home and hearth. The almanac's popularity also brought Franklin into public notice, giving him a platform that few colonial Americans could dream of, opening doors to intellectual circles and political conversation, laying the groundwork for his later influence in civic life. Behind the playful aphorisms, some researchers believe, lay a man intensely curious about human behavior, about the potential for self-improvement, about the laws, both natural and social, that governed life. And in this quiet, relentless work of print and persuasion, Franklin was building something far larger than words on paper. He was building a reputation, a philosophy, a method of living that would prepare him for the far greater tasks to come. One cannot help but wonder, who was the young printer behind Richard Saunders? And did he already imagine the world he would one day help to shape? Sit back and imagine the sky above Philadelphia on a humid summer afternoon in 1752. The clouds swollen, the wind carrying the scent of rain and ozone. Benjamin Franklin, already a man of letters and wit, was turning his attention to the very heavens themselves, to the invisible forces that crackled above. Electricity, mysterious, untamed, and unpredictable, had captured his imagination. Others had experimented, yes, but Franklin approached it with a rare combination of curiosity, caution, and theatrical flair. He hypothesized that lightning was not a unique, celestial phenomenon, but a powerful form of electrical discharge, the same energy that one could produce in small jars in his laboratory. Some contemporaries dismissed such ideas as folly, yet Franklin pursued them with relentless focus. The most famous of his experiments, the kite experiment, was not merely a stunt, but a carefully designed test of theory. Flying a kite in a kite in a kite in a storm with a key attached to its string. Franklin aimed to draw the invisible electricity from the sky, to capture a spark of the storm itself. The image of Franklin, standing in a tempest with rain-soaked hair and eyes alight with determination, has become almost mythic, but the truth was quieter, more meticulous, a blend of patience, intellect, and courage. Through these experiments, he demonstrated the electrical nature of lightning and invented the lightning rod, a simple device that would protect buildings from the destructive power of storms. Beyond practical applications, Franklin's work revealed a deeper truth about the natural world, that even the wildest forces obey laws, that curiosity and reason can bring understanding to the seemingly chaotic. He published his findings, sending letters across the Atlantic, capturing the attention of scientists in Europe, earning him a place in the Royal Society, and cementing his reputation not just as a colonial thinker, but as a mind capable of shaping the global understanding of nature. But Franklin was never satisfied with theory alone. He delighted in demonstrations, in the way electricity leapt from one object to another, in the crackling sound, the sharp smell, the visible spark that made the invisible visible. Some researchers suggest that his experiments were as much about communication as discovery, about inspiring awe, wonder, and the belief that humans could grasp the secrets of the universe. In the midst of this scientific pursuit, Franklin's mind was already turning to society, politics, and the ways in which knowledge could empower a new nation. And so, from the electric sky of a summer storm, we see the seeds of a man who would illuminate not just buildings, but history itself. What other forces, both natural and human, was he destined to master next? Before the world knew Benjamin Franklin as a diplomat, inventor, or philosopher, it knew him as a printer, a man who transformed ink, paper, and words into instruments of influence. Picture the streets of Philadelphia in the early 1730s, filled with the scent of fresh parchment, the rhythmic clatter of presses, and the warm glow of candlelight spilling onto the narrow alleys. Franklin, still in his 20s, was already a master of this world, apprenticed under his brother, learning the precise craft of letterpress, the delicate mixing of ink, the careful alignment of type. But Franklin was not content to simply reproduce words. He sought to shape them, to guide thought, to entertain, to educate, and to challenge. He began publishing pamphlets, essays, and, most famously, Poor Richard's Almanac, a publication that would reach thousands of homes across the colonies, offering practical advice, witty observations, and moral aphorisms that lingered in the mind like sparks of insight. Some historians suggest that Franklin understood the power of print not merely as a business, but as a subtle form of persuasion, a way to influence society without force or decree. Through his almanac, he spread knowledge of the weather, astronomical events, and tides, but also virtues, thrift, and clever sayings that became ingrained in American culture. It was in this world of letters and presses that Franklin honed his voice, developing the clarity, humor, and subtle cunning that would later serve him in diplomacy. The printing shop was also a social hub, a place where ideas were exchanged, where debates raged over politics, religion, and philosophy, where Franklin could observe human nature in its messy, unguarded state. Here, he learned that influence often comes from the softest touch, the right phrase, the clever story, the timely joke lessons he would carry across oceans and into royal courts. And yet, Franklin's success as a printer was not merely about ambition. It was about curiosity, observation, and the restless desire to improve not only his own circumstances, but the lives of others. Each pamphlet, each neatly inked page, was a step toward a larger vision, a vision of an informed, engaged public capable of reasoned thought. The press became the first instrument in a lifetime devoted to shaping a new world. But as he mastered the printed word, Franklin's eyes were already turning outward, towards science, invention, and the turbulent currents of politics that would soon demand his attention. How would the boy who learned to command words command nations? By the mid-1740s, Benjamin Franklin had begun to turn his restless curiosity toward the invisible forces of the natural world. Forces that hummed and crackled unseen in the air around him. Imagine the skies over Philadelphia during a summer storm. Dark clouds roiling and the scent of ozone thick on the wind. A distant rumble of thunder vibrating through the wooden streets. Franklin, ever observant, watched these storms with the eyes of both a child and a philosopher, seeing patterns where others saw chaos, asking questions that most would never dare. Some researchers believe that his fascination with electricity began as a playful experiment, with static shocks from camphor or amber, but it soon grew into an obsession that consumed his thoughts day and night. He devised curious instruments, delicate kites, and iron keys, conducting experiments in his home, in gardens, even at the risk of his own life, seeking to capture and understand the mysterious spark that danced invisibly through the air. In 1752, he performed what would become the legendary kite experiment. Flying a simple kite in a violent thunderstorm, the wind whipping around him, raindrops soaking his clothes. As a key tied to the string crackled with electricity, it was a dangerous pursuit, one that some contemporaries viewed as reckless. But Franklin saw something profound, the unity of natural forces, the potential to harness them, and a glimpse of the secrets the universe quietly obeyed. From this experiment came the lightning rod, a humble yet revolutionary invention that would protect homes, ships, and cities from nature's destructive power, demonstrating that human ingenuity could bend even the skies to our will. Beyond the practical, Franklin's work on electricity captured imaginations across continents. His experiments were shared, discussed, and celebrated in the salons of Paris and the halls of London. Philosophers and scientists marveled at his observations, and Franklin's name became synonymous with the idea that a single mind, armed with curiosity and daring, could reveal the hidden laws of nature. Yet for Franklin, the lightning rod was not the pinnacle, but a symbol of a larger belief, that knowledge was a tool, a gift, and a responsibility. And as his discoveries electrified the scientific world, a quieter transformation was taking place. The boy from Boston was slowly becoming a figure of influence, a man whose genius would soon cross oceans and reshape nations. But science was only the beginning. How would Franklin turn his curiosity into the currents of revolution, diplomacy, and the shaping of a new world? Before Benjamin Franklin could command the skies or sway foreign courts, he first mastered the power of the written word, a force that could travel faster than armies, that could shape minds and stir imaginations in ways no sword ever could. Picture colonial Philadelphia in the early 1720s, a city of cobblestone streets, flickering oil lamps, the smell of fresh bread mingling with smoke from chimneys, where Franklin's printing press sat in a small, cluttered workshop, the rhythmic clatter of type on paper echoing late into the night. As a young man, Franklin had apprenticed under his brother James, learning the meticulous craft of setting type, mixing inks, and producing sheets of newspapers and pamphlets that might change how people thought about the world. Yet Franklin was restless, ambitious, and impatient. He chafed under the strict rules of apprenticeship and the narrow world-view of his brother. Some accounts suggest he fled the city under cover of night, traveling with little more than a bundle of clothes, and the burning desire to write his own story. In Philadelphia, he set up his own press and began publishing works that would gradually reveal the mind behind the man. He wrote essays under pseudonyms such as Silence, Dogood, weaving humor, satire, and practical wisdom into observations of Orge in Philadelphia's of everyday life. Readers laughed at his wit, nodded at his advice, and slowly Franklin's reputation as a thinker and commentator began to spread. But he did not stop at mere words. He expanded into the almanac, a yearly collection of weather, predictions, proverbs, and scientific tidbits that found its way into homes across the colonies. Poor Richard's Almanac, as it became known, was not just a guide to planting seasons or a compendium of knowledge. It was a reflection of Franklin himself, a mix of practicality, cleverness, moral insight, and subtle humor. Through it, he reached millions, shaping ideas about industry, frugality, and virtue, teaching readers to aspire to self-improvement, to think critically, to question authority gently but persistently. Franklin understood that the pen could wield power more quietly, more persistently than the sword. His words created networks of influence, opened doors, and built trust long before he would ever step into the courts of Europe. From the clatter of the press to the quiet reflection over ink and paper, Franklin was crafting not only a career, but a legacy, one that would allow him to later navigate the storms of diplomacy, war, and revolution. And as his printed words crossed towns and colonies, the question lingered. Could this same man, armed with wit and wisdom, persuade entire nations to follow a cause yet untested? Benjamin Franklin's ascent from a restless apprentice to one of the most influential figures in colonial America was neither sudden nor guaranteed. It was a careful weaving of curiosity, ambition, and relentless self-education, a tapestry threaded with experimentation, observation, and a fascination with the hidden patterns of the world. Imagine him in the small, dimly lit rooms of Philadelphia, surrounded by stacks of books, scraps of paper covered in notes, and the occasional stray candle dripping wax onto a wooden desk. Here, in these humble chambers, Franklin taught himself Latin, Greek, and the principles of science and philosophy, delving into the works of Newton, Locke, and other thinkers whose ideas would shape his understanding of the natural and social worlds. He observed the skies, noted the patterns of storms, and experimented with electricity, imagining invisible forces moving through the air, unseen yet powerful. Some researchers suggest that Franklin's obsession with understanding the world was a form of quiet rebellion against the limits imposed by his modest birth, a refusal to accept that knowledge and influence were reserved for the wealthy or well-born. Others argue it was simply the mind of a man incapable of sitting still, a mind that needed to explore, to question, to build, and to tinker with the very fabric of reality. Franklin's inventions during this period, bifocal glasses, the flexible stove, and early experiments with electricity were not just practical solutions. They were statements of possibility, proof that observation and reason could reshape daily life. But his curiosity was not limited to science. He became a civic philosopher, pondering questions of morality, governance, and human behavior. He wrote essays and letters on ethics, thrift, and social responsibility, offering guidance on how a person might live well, contribute to their community, and achieve self-mastery. This combination of practical intelligence and moral reflection gave Franklin a unique authority, a presence that would later allow him to move through the halls of power with a credibility that seemed effortless. By the time he turned 40, Franklin was not just a printer or inventor, He was a thinker whose ideas carried weight in taverns and drawing rooms alike. Yet even as he achieved fame in the colonies, he would soon face a challenge that would test all his skills: diplomacy, persuasion, and the subtle art of performance on a stage far larger than any printing shop, the courts and salons of Europe, where the fate of a fledgling nation hung in delicate balance. Could the same mind that tamed lightning and captured attention with wit now persuade kings and ministers to embrace revolution? That question would soon propel Franklin across the Atlantic into a world of intrigue, elegance, and danger. In the late autumn of 1776, Benjamin Franklin, at the age of 70, prepared for a journey that would test not only his body, already weakened by gout and the persistent pain of kidney stones, but also the entirety of his reputation and intellect. Picture him aboard the creaking wooden vessel, the salt-laden wind whipping against his face, the ocean's relentless rhythm pressing against the hull, a constant reminder of the uncertainty that lay ahead. For over a month, Franklin endured the swaying monotony of the crossing, seasickness, and the gnawing discomfort of old age. Yet his mind remained sharp, plotting every step of his diplomatic endeavor with meticulous care. When he finally landed at the small fishing village of Quiberon Bay in Brittany on December 3rd, 1776, the chill of the French winter bit through his clothing. But Franklin understood immediately that the battle he faced was not fought with muskets or cannons, but with perception, charm, and the subtle art of persuasion. The French court, led by King Louis XVI and his cautious foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, were intrigued by the American rebellion, yet wary of openly supporting it. France had its own scars from conflict, having lost Canada to Britain only 13 years prior, and the thought of renewed hostilities carried immense risk. Franklin could not promise victory on the battlefield, nor could he offer tangible proof of the revolution's strength. What he could offer, however, was himself, a living symbol of the new world, a blend of reason, wisdom, and carefully curated charisma. He abandoned the powdered wigs that were the hallmark of European sophistication, letting his natural grey hair show, often topped with a simple fur cap. This modest garment, unassuming yet striking in its authenticity, became a sensation, an emblem of American simplicity and virtue, in contrast to the opulence and decadence of European aristocracy. Portraits of Franklin with his fur cap spread across Paris, appearing on medallions, snuff boxes, and even jewelry, while women adopted his style in hair fashion. He attended salons and dinners, conversed with philosophers, flattered aristocrats, and charmed influential women, all the while presenting himself as a philosopher-statesman from a nascent republic, a man whose intellect and virtue embodied the promise of a freer, enlightened world. Franklin's performance was deliberate, yet infused with a truth that made it irresistible. The French were captivated, intrigued, and enchanted, but admiration alone would not secure an alliance. The question lingered like a shadow over Parisian salons. Could this old man from Philadelphia turn fascination into commitment and curiosity into action? Franklin's arrival in Paris marked the beginning of a careful, patient, and nearly theatrical campaign of persuasion, one that would depend less on treaties and more on the power of presence. Picture the streets of 18th century Paris, gas lamps flickering in the foggy evenings, the chatter of aristocrats spilling from the gilded salons, the scent of roasted chestnuts drifting from crowded squares, and among it all, an elderly American, with his grey hair peeking from beneath a humble fur cap, walking with deliberate slowness, yet commanding every gaze. Franklin understood the nuances of European society, having spent decades in London, learning its rituals, its expectations, and its subtle hierarchies, yet he wielded his experience not to blend in, but to stand apart. The fur cap, seemingly an act of rustic simplicity, became an emblem, a tool that conveyed his authenticity, his independence, and the untamed promise of a new world untouched by the corruption of European courts. Women fawned over him, adopting his style in their coiffures, while men debated his wisdom in hushed, awed tones, and the press of Paris chronicled his every appearance with admiration that verged on fascination. Yet Franklin's charm was only one piece of a far larger puzzle. France's hesitation was real and rooted in prudence. To openly support a rebellion against a fellow monarchy could invite catastrophic consequences should the Americans fail. Franklin's task was therefore to demonstrate that the American cause was not a reckless gamble, but a serious and winnable enterprise. For months he attended dinners and salons, weaving himself into the intellectual and social fabric of the city, discussing the philosophies of liberty, reason, and self-governance with scholars and aristocrats alike. He flattered, joked, and exchanged letters filled with wit and insight, all while subtly guiding the French elite toward the notion that supporting the American Revolution was not only morally right, but strategically advantageous. His presence became a living argument, a constant, persuasive reminder that the colonies were more than insurgents. They were the embodiment of an idea, a civilization in miniature, capable of reasoning, self-governance, and resilience. And yet, despite his growing fame, despite the glittering medallions, portraits, and salons that celebrated him, Franklin knew that admiration alone would not suffice. France demanded proof of military competence, evidence that the fledgling republic could withstand the might of Britain. Franklin had charmed a nation, but the ultimate question lingered in every corridor and salon of Paris. Could America win, or was all this fascination destined to collapse into disappointment? The long-awaited answer arrived from the muddy fields of upstate New York, where the cold autumn wind swept over the jagged hills and forests, carrying the echoes of musket fire and the cries of men locked in battle. At Saratoga, an American army under General Horatio Gates had achieved what many in Europe had deemed impossible. They had surrounded and forced the surrender of nearly 6,000 British troops, led by General John Burgoyne. The news traveled slowly across the Atlantic, arriving in Paris like a whisper of destiny on the 4th of December 1777. Yet its impact was immediate and profound. Franklin, in his modest residence on the outskirts of the city, received the dispatch and understood the magnitude of what had occurred. Here was tangible proof that the colonies were not a ragged collection of rebels, but a force capable of strategic planning, resilience, and victory. With this single event, the delicate balance that had kept France hesitant began to tip, and the cautious calculations of the French Foreign Minister, Verne, shifted toward action. Franklin moved with the quiet urgency of a man who knew the stakes. Were as high as they could be, negotiations commenced in earnest, words measured, alliances considered, and the intricate dance of diplomacy began. Within weeks, by February 6, 1778, 2 treaties were signed at the Hôtel de Rohan in Paris. The first, a treaty of amity and commerce, laid the foundation for trade between the fledgling United States and France, establishing a bond of mutual benefit and economic interest. The second, far weightier, was a treaty of alliance that committed France to fight alongside America until independence was achieved. A promise that bound the two nations together and forbade separate peace with Britain. The implications were staggering. French money poured into American coffers. Supplies and weapons crossed the Atlantic. Military advisors like the young Marquis de Lafayette joined Washington. And, most crucially, the French Navy entered the conflict, challenging British supremacy at sea for the first time. The tide of the war had shifted, yet Franklin remained aware that an alliance alone did not guarantee victory. The path ahead was treacherous, filled with harsh winters, strategic setbacks, and the constant threat of defeat. Still, Saratoga had done what no words, no charm, and no fur cap could achieve. It had proven the carnies could win, and with France now committed, a new chapter in the struggle for independence had begun. And as Franklin contemplated the battlefield miles away, he understood that history was unfolding before him, that every calculated move, every meeting in Parisian salons, and every smile he had offered to French aristocrats had led to this moment. But the true cost of the coming years was yet to be revealed. Paris in the late 1770s was a city of contrasts, a world of grandeur and intellect where gaslit streets and candlelit salons converged with gardens perfumed by winter blossoms and the murmurs of philosophical debate. Benjamin Franklin arrived not as a mere diplomat, but as a figure who embodied the promise of a new world, a living symbol of reason, curiosity, and understated genius. Settling in a comfortable house in Pacey, on a hillside overlooking the Seine, he found himself embraced by a city eager for ideas and novelty. The residence belonged to a wealthy merchant sympathetic to the American cause, who refused rent, understanding that Franklin's presence was a boon to both politics and culture. Within its walls, Franklin's life became a delicate balance between duty and delight, as he navigated the intricacies of French high society with the same careful attention he once gave to his printing presses. He attended dinners where chandeliers glittered and conversations sparkled with wit. He entered salons where the greatest minds of France's philosophers, scientists, and poets gathered to debate the natural world, human virtue, and the possibilities of governance. In these moments, Franklin could indulge his curiosity, observing, questioning, and sometimes provoking laughter with essays of mischievous humor, like the infamous Fart, Proudly, which mocked the pretensions of learned societies, while revealing his irrepressible playfulness. Women adored him, not merely for his fame, but for the warmth of his wit, the subtle charm of his manner, and the intellectual companionship he offered. Analyse Dardenbury, 30 years his junior, called him Mener, Papa, and their hundreds of letters exchanged a tender, flirtatious intimacy, while the widow Catherine Delinville, philosopher Helveti's widow, became another confidant, engaging in conversations that traversed science, art, and morality. Despite this social vibrancy, Franklin remained a man acutely aware of his age, his ailments, and the distance from home. Kidney stones and gout often brought him discomfort, and his letters revealed an undertone of longing for the familiar streets of Philadelphia and the warmth of family. Yet, the city stimulated him. He witnessed the first Montgolfier hot air, balloon ascend with a sheep, a duck, and a rooster. Questioning aloud the potential of flight and seeing, as he often did, promise in the impossible. Franklin's inventions continued, including improvements to his bifocal spectacles, enabling him to observe both the faces of his companions and the page before him without shifting glasses. Chess became a ritual of strategy and reflection, sometimes played for hours, occasionally submerged in the quiet warmth of his bathtub. The years in Paris were a mixture of triumph, curiosity, and subtle melancholy, a period that revealed the human side of a man who had become a legend, yet still wrestled with the simple, persistent questions of life, age, and purpose. And as the candles burned late into the night, Franklin's mind was never still, always turning toward the next discovery, the next connection, the next step in a revolution that was both distant and intimately his own. As winter cloaked the northern colonies in relentless cold and mud, the fate of the American Revolution hung by a fragile thread, uncertain and tremulous. Much like the icy waters that lapped the banks of the Hudson River, in upstate New York, an army of ordinary men, farmers and tradesmen, led by General Horatio Gates, prepared for a confrontation that would echo across the Atlantic. On the muddy fields of Saratoga, fog and gun smoke mingled, creating a haze where courage, desperation, and chance intertwined. The British, under General John Burgoyne, believed their disciplined forces would crush the rebels swiftly, yet they underestimated the resolve and ingenuity of the American soldiers. As muskets cracked and the earth shook under the thunder of artillery, the Americans encircled the British, cutting off their escape, a maneuver so precise it seemed almost preordained. The surrender of nearly 6,000 British troops marked more than a tactical victory. It became a symbol, a proof that the fledgling nation could endure, could resist, could triumph. Across the ocean in Paris, the news arrived like a spark in a winter night, lighting hope in the hearts of those who had doubted. Benjamin Franklin, ever astute, recognized the opportunity immediately. The cautious French foreign minister, Vergennes, who had long hesitated to commit his nation to a rebellion, now faced undeniable evidence that the Americans were not merely a rabble to be swept aside. Franklin moved with a subtle urgency, arranging meetings, conversations, and private councils. Every gesture, every word, became part of a larger, intricate performance where diplomacy and perception merged. Within weeks, negotiations accelerated, the air charged with anticipation and possibility. By February 6, 1778, history had been quietly but irrevocably altered. At the Hôtel de Rohan in Paris, 2 treaties were signed. The Treaty of Amity and Commerce, establishing formal trade relations between France and the United States, and the Treaty of Alliance, committing France to military support until American independence was secured. The implications were profound. French ships would sail into battle, French soldiers would march alongside the Continental Army, and funds, weapons, and supplies would flow across the Atlantic. The balance of power in the conflict shifted in an instant, yet the path ahead remained treacherous. British retaliation loomed. Winters would be harsh, and loyalty within the American ranks fragile. Franklin, enduring constant pain from kidney stones and weariness from years of service, remained in Paris, managing the alliance, navigating the delicate interplay of European politics, and ensuring that the fledgling republic could survive the storm. And while the world outside celebrated treaties and armies, Franklin's mind, restless and endlessly calculating, already turned to the next challenge, securing not just survival but victory, and shaping a new nation from the uncertain shadows of war. The tide had turned, yet the man at the center of it was far from finished. Paris in the late 1770s was a city of contradictions, a place where opulence and intellect collided, where the grandeur of palaces stood alongside the whispered debates of smoky salons, and where the scent of roasting chestnuts mingled with the sharp tang of ink and parchment. Benjamin Franklin, now in his 70s, arrived in this city not merely as a diplomat but as a phenomenon, a man whose fame preceded him and whose presence demanded attention, settling into a comfortable house. In Passy, on the outskirts of the bustling French capital, Franklin found a world that both delighted and challenged him. Gardens and terraces stretched from his windows, offering glimpses of the Seine glinting in the afternoon sun, while the distant hum of carriages and street chatter reminded him that he was far from the cobbled streets of Philadelphia he had once called home. Within these walls, Franklin engaged with Parisian society in ways that few could imagine. He attended lavish dinners where philosophers debated the nature of reason and morality. Scientists showcased their latest experiments, and aristocrats whispered of politics and power, often unaware that the man in the fur cap they adored was quietly shaping the course of history. He dined with Voltaire, the two old men embracing with warmth and familiarity, their shared laughter echoing through the Academy of Sciences, a moment of quiet humanity amidst a world of ambition and intrigue. Franklin's curiosity was insatiable. When the Montgolfier brothers launched their first hot air balloon in 1783, sending a sheep, a duck, and a rooster into the sky in a fragile wicker basket, Franklin marveled at the spectacle, questioning the purpose, yet seeing limitless possibility, reflecting the very essence of his lifelong pursuit of knowledge. Beyond the public acclaim, Franklin's days were filled with inventions, experiments, and endless correspondence. He perfected his bifocals, crafted with lenses for distance above and reading below, allowing him to navigate both conversation and scrutiny with ease. Yet, despite the admiration, the honors, and the love of French society, there lingered a quiet solitude. Letters to friends in America carried hints of longing and melancholy, reminders that he was exiled not by law but by necessity, bound to a cause greater than personal comfort. Affectionate friendships with women like Annalise Dardenne, Brie, and Catherine Delenville brought emotional richness and companionship, but also the subtle ache of unattainable intimacy, a reflection of the compromises demanded by a life devoted to public service. And through it all, Franklin remained a man of paradox, celebrated and lonely, vigorous in mind yet frail in body, a bridge between worlds and eras, a living emblem of the new republic he fought to secure. The streets of Paris might have been paved with grandeur, but for Franklin, every stone echoed with the weight of duty, curiosity, and the quiet question that never left him. What more could one man achieve in a life already overflowing with triumphs? The year was 1783, and the air in Paris carried a strange mixture of anticipation and exhaustion, as if the city itself was holding its breath for news that could reshape the world. Benjamin Franklin, seated at his desk surrounded by stacks of correspondence, drafts, and reports, understood the magnitude of the moment he was shaping. The American Revolution had dragged on for 8 grueling years, and though victory at Yorktown had signaled the beginning of the end, the work of diplomacy was far from complete. Across the Atlantic, British envoys had arrived in Paris with guarded expressions, their every gesture calculated, their every word measured, knowing that the fate of empires hung on the fragile threads of negotiation. Franklin moved with the calm precision of a man who had seen both the glory and the brutality of history. Every meeting was a delicate dance, a performance where one misstep could unravel years of struggle. He had allies in the French court, men like the young Marquis de Lafayette and the ever-cautious Foreign Minister Vergennes. Yet even with their support, the negotiations were perilous. The British offered terms that seemed generous on the surface, a reflection of war weariness and recognition that the Americans could not be crushed. Yet Franklin saw through the veneer. He pressed for full independence, territorial recognition, and fair treatment of debts and trade terms that would establish the United States not as a colony, but as a sovereign nation. The negotiations were slow, punctuated by long evenings, where quills scratched endlessly across parchment, the flickering candlelight casting shadows that danced like ghosts of the battles past. Franklin's health, already fragile, suffered in the dim heat of candlelit rooms, yet his mind remained razor-sharp, his humor intact, his ability to charm, cajole, and reason unmatched. He often entertained his counterparts with quiet wit, stories of colonial life, and the odd scientific anecdote, softening the rigidity of protocol with human warmth. After months of delicate maneuvering, compromise, and persuasion, the Treaty of Paris was finally signed in September of 1783, recognizing the United States as a free and independent nation. For Franklin, it was more than a diplomatic victory. It was the culmination of a lifetime spent shaping ideas into reality, a testament to patience, intellect, and the unyielding belief that a fledgling nation could stand against empires. As he watched the envoys depart, documents in hand, Franklin must have felt the strange mixture of relief and anticipation that accompanies creation itself, knowing that a new chapter of history had begun, yet that his work was far from finished. For a nation's birth is merely the prelude to the trials and triumphs yet to come. With the Treaty of Paris concluded, Benjamin Franklin remained in Paris, a city that had become a second home, a place where the cobblestones echoed with the whispers of revolution and the scent of possibility hung in the air. His residence in Pacy, a comfortable house on a hillside overlooking the Seine, was more than shelter. It was a sanctuary. The gardens and terraces surrounding the house offered quiet reprieves from the endless diplomacy, spaces where Franklin could watch the light ripple across the river, hear the distant laughter of children, and feel the wind carry the scent of distant flowers. The city embraced him with a mixture of admiration and fascination. Salons filled with the brightest minds of France's philosophers, scientists, musicians, and aristocrats welcomed him as an embodiment of the new world, a man who had tamed lightning and helped forge a republic. He dined with Voltaire, the two old men embracing with such warmth that the audience purportedly wept at the sight, a testament not just to Franklin's fame but to the resonance of his ideals. Honors followed in quick succession: election to the French Academy, public recognition in newspapers and engravings, and constant invitations to participate in discussions that shaped thought across the continent. Despite the adulation, Franklin's personal life remained a source of quiet intrigue. He formed affectionate friendships with prominent French women, intellectual companions who inspired both joy and reflection. Analyse Dardenne, a musician 30 years his junior, called him Mon Papa, and hundreds of letters flowed between them, filled with playful declarations, a blend of affection and philosophical exchange. Catherine Denonville, widow of the philosopher Helvetius, became another close confidant, their companionship rooted in intellect and emotional connection, even touching upon marriage proposals, though unfulfilled. Franklin's curiosity remained insatiable. He witnessed the Montgolfier brothers' first hot air balloon launch in 1783, marveling as a sheep, a duck, and a rooster rose into the sky in a wicker basket. When asked the purpose of such a device, he reportedly replied, "What is the use of a newborn baby?" His humor, intellect, and boundless curiosity intertwined, leading him to invent bifocals and refine experiments in electricity, all while navigating the complexities of a city steeped in both culture and political tension. Yet beneath the pleasures, there was a quiet solitude. Letters to America carried longing and homesickness, reminders that despite the grandeur and intellectual stimulation of Paris, Franklin was far from home. Even as he embraced the joys of discovery, friendship, and admiration, the weight of age, illness, and distance pressed upon him, a subtle undercurrent beneath the vibrant tapestry of his Parisian life. Leaving the question, how does a man balance personal joy with the demands of a world he helped to shape, and what does he truly seek when fame and influence surround him? As the cannons fell silent and the smoke of battle lingered in memory, Benjamin Franklin turned his attention to a task that required as much subtlety and patience as any battlefield maneuver: negotiating peace. The war for American independence had ended with Yorktown in 1781, but the final terms, the legal recognition of a nation born from rebellion, remained uncertain, and the eyes of Europe were fixed upon him. Franklin, seasoned by decades of diplomacy, understood that the outcome would define not just the fledgling United States, but the balance of power across the Atlantic. He moved through the ornate halls of Paris with quiet determination, meeting with French ministers, British diplomats, and American colleagues, a careful observer in rooms filled with tension and hidden agendas. The French government, now a steadfast ally, provided both support and subtle pressure, ensuring that Britain understood the seriousness of negotiations. Franklin's approach was meticulous. He cultivated patience as a weapon, allowing discussions to unfold while carefully reading the temperaments and motivations of those across the table. Letters and dispatches traveled between continents, each word weighed, each pause calculated. Some researchers believe Franklin's skill lay in his ability to project calm authority while hinting at the consequences of delay. Others suggest it was his reputation, his very presence, that commanded attention. In quiet moments, he walked the streets of Paris, reflecting on the irony that a man who had spent a lifetime challenging authority now relied on its subtle manipulation to secure freedom. The final agreement, signed in 1783, formalized the recognition of the United States, established borders, and secured promises of trade and diplomacy. It was a victory that required no musket, no bayonet, but the same intellect, perseverance, and understanding of human nature that had guided him through salons, debates, and the stormy seas of international politics. Franklin emerged from the process not only as a diplomat but as a symbol of the new nation's ideals. A man whose experience bridged continents and whose vision encompassed both liberty and pragmatism. Yet even as he celebrated the conclusion of war, he felt the weight of years and the pull of home. Paris had been a stage for his genius, a city that adored him and shaped him, But the Atlantic awaited, and the next chapter of his life demanded a return to the land he had fought to liberate. The Treaty of Paris was complete, but Franklin's journey was far from over. Questions lingered about the future of the nation, the fragile unity of the states, and the role he would play in shaping the principles that might bind them together. In the quiet of his study, as candlelight flickered against shelves lined with books and scientific instruments, he considered the delicate balance between diplomacy and idealism, and the immense responsibility that awaited on the shores of America. A responsibility that would test the limits of both body and mind. After nearly a decade abroad, Benjamin Franklin finally prepared to leave the streets of Paris that had celebrated him, the salons that had challenged him, and the riverbanks where he had walked in thought and contemplation. At 79, his body frail and burdened by gout and kidney stones, he embarked on the long voyage across the Atlantic, the same ocean that had carried him to Europe years before, now filled with a sense of homecoming and quiet anticipation. The ship creaked under the weight of the cargo and passengers, the salt air stinging his lungs, yet Franklin's mind remained alert, cataloguing every sensation, every detail of the journey, as if committing it to memory for some unseen purpose. He imagined the streets of Philadelphia, the familiar brick buildings, the faces of old friends and family, the bustling harbor alive with the commerce of a new nation he had helped birth. As the coastline appeared, mist curling over the water, Franklin felt a strange mixture of triumph and melancholy, the recognition that the land he had served with such devotion had changed in his absence, yet remained a mirror of the ideals he had fought for. Upon landing, a crowd gathered, whispers spreading quickly through the city, people recognizing the man whose image had been admired and imitated across Europe, the man who had carried the hopes of a revolution across the Atlantic. He was greeted as a hero, but Franklin, ever self-aware, felt the weight of years and the quiet toll of sacrifice. Letters and emissaries had preceded him, detailing every negotiation, every alliance, every trial, and he understood that his homecoming was as much symbolic as it was personal. Friends, family, and political leaders sought his counsel immediately, and the streets were alive with celebration, church bells ringing, flags waving, and carriage wheels rattling against the cobblestones. Yet, amid the fanfare, Franklin found moments of solitude, walking through gardens and along familiar streets, reflecting on the choices he had made, the lives intertwined with his own, and the vision of a republic he had long pursued. Some researchers suggest that Franklin's return was a period of introspection, a quiet reckoning with both success and the personal cost of his relentless service. Others propose that he was already preparing for the next chapter, the creation of a governance framework that would solidify the fragile union of states. The arrival in Philadelphia was not merely a celebration of victory, it was the prelude to another monumental undertaking, one that would require the wisdom of a lifetime, the patience to negotiate deeply divided minds, and the courage to leave an enduring mark on a nation still finding its identity. As the city hummed with curiosity and expectation, Franklin understood that the story of the United States was far from complete, and his role in shaping it was only beginning, setting the stage for the great debates and decisions that would follow. In the sweltering summer of 1787, Philadelphia became a crucible of ideas, tension, and possibility as delegates from 12 states gathered under one roof to wrestle with the fate of a fledgling nation. Benjamin Franklin, now 81 years old, entered the room with a body weakened by decades of labor, gout, and kidney stones, yet a mind as sharp as ever, a living repository of experience, diplomacy, and quiet wisdom. Carried in a sedan chair along the streets lined with curious citizens, he was both a symbol of continuity and a reminder of what the new nation could achieve through reason and perseverance. The hall was thick with heat, the windows shuttered against eavesdroppers, the air vibrating with the murmur of debate and the occasional clash of voices as representatives from large and small states, North and South, argued over the structure of a government that could hold such diverse territories and peoples together. Franklin spoke little at first, his frail voice forcing him to write out remarks to be read by others, yet every intervention carried weight. His presence lent legitimacy, signaling that this gathering was no idle assembly of ambitious men, but a serious effort to forge a lasting framework for governance. At crucial moments, when tempers flared and compromise seemed impossible, Franklin's gestures, proposing prayers at the start of each session, offering gentle reminders of humility and shared purpose, helped steady the room, his reputation, an intellect quietly guiding the convention toward cohesion. He understood the necessity of compromise, the imperfection of any human creation, and he embodied patience as delegates wrestled with representation, slavery, taxation, and the balance of power. Observers would later note the quiet authority in his demeanor, the calm calculation behind his smiles, the subtle humor that sometimes cut tension without diminishing seriousness. Franklin's interventions were often philosophical, rooted in decades of observing human nature, politics, and the fragile interplay between liberty and order. As the debates stretched on through weeks of oppressive heat, the hall filled with the rustle of papers, the scratch of quills, and the occasional raised voice, Franklin's eyes scanned the room constantly, noting alliances, rivalries, and the potential for consensus. Some historians suggest that his advanced age and reputation made him a living bridge between the revolutionary generation and the uncertain present. Others argue that his careful diplomacy and strategic silence amplified his influence more than any speech could. As the convention neared its conclusion, the imperfect yet monumental document was ready, and Franklin faced his final challenge: to persuade others that compromise, imperfection, and unity were preferable to conflict, division, and indecision. Setting the stage for the ultimate signing and his enduring mark on the nation's foundation. Benjamin Franklin's death did not mark an end, but rather the beginning of a story that would ripple across centuries, shaping not only the United States, but the very idea of what a human life could accomplish. His inventions, though practical in their original conception, took on symbolic weight over time. The lightning rod that tamed the fury of storms became more than metal and wood. It represented human ingenuity confronting the unpredictable forces of nature. His bifocals, quietly revolutionizing vision, became emblematic of clarity, the ability to see both the immediate and the distant, the practical and the philosophical, simultaneously. Franklin's experiments with electricity, once regarded with curiosity and even suspicion, laid the groundwork for a future that he could not possibly have imagined. An age where human understanding could bend the forces of nature to its will. Yet, perhaps even more enduring than his scientific contributions were his civic endeavors. The institutions he helped create, the public library, the volunteer fire department, the secular university, the public hospital, were not merely structures of stone or collections of books, They were living testaments to the idea that ordinary citizens could come together to solve shared problems, that society itself could be crafted through deliberate effort and collective will. Franklin's writings, from Poor Richard's Almanac to his unfinished autobiography, carried both humor and moral guidance, presenting wisdom that was accessible yet layered with subtlety, a reflection of his understanding that human behavior is never simple, and that progress often comes through patience, reflection, and perseverance. At the same time, his life was marked by contradictions that make his story all the more compelling. A man who once owned slaves, yet became an ardent abolitionist. A father often distant from his children, but deeply devoted when present. A diplomat, whose charm could manipulate, yet whose sincerity inspired genuine loyalty. These contradictions do not diminish him. They make him human, reminding us that greatness is not the absence of flaw, but the navigation of it. His image, appearing on the $100 bill, serves as a daily, quiet reminder of his lasting influence, a symbol of innovation, prudence, and ambition. Scholars continue to debate his motivations, his philosophy, the balance between his personal ambition and public service, yet in every discussion the shadow of Franklin's intellect looms large. What remains most mysterious, perhaps, is not the man himself, but the life he imagined and the world he helped to shape. A world where curiosity, reason, and action intersect to forge enduring change. As we reflect on his story, we are left to wonder, in a life so fully lived, what sparks of Franklin's vision continue to ripple through our modern world, unseen yet undeniably present. Sit back and let your mind wander to the bustling streets of Philadelphia, the air thick with smoke from chimneys, the chatter of merchants, and the distant echo of horse hooves on cobblestone, because here, in the heart of a young and restless city, Benjamin Franklin became more than a man. He became a symbol of possibility. He was not merely witnessing revolution. He was shaping it, molding it with wit, persuasion, and careful foresight. Some researchers believe that Franklin understood the American Revolution not just as a political struggle, but as an experiment in human nature itself, a test of whether ordinary citizens, armed with ideas and determination, could create a functioning society from scratch. Others suggest that Franklin's fascination with science, reason, and human potential made him uniquely suited to serve as both architect and ambassador for these fragile new ideals. Imagine him pacing the floor of his study late at night, quill in hand, candles flickering, maps and letters spread before him, plotting the diplomacy that would eventually secure France's alliance. You can almost hear the soft scratching of his pen and the quiet hum of contemplation, the kind of patience that comes from decades of observing, learning, and experimenting. Franklin knew the stakes were enormous. A failed revolution would mean not only the loss of lives and resources, but also the discrediting of a bold experiment in liberty and self-governance that he had come to cherish. From one mystery to the next, his genius was in subtlety, appearing affable, even whimsical. In public while negotiating treaties that would shift the balance of power across oceans. He understood performance, image, and perception, how a fur cap, a simple gesture, or a witty remark could stir public sentiment and influence kings and ministers alike. And yet, behind the charm and strategy, there was a deep-seated conviction, a belief that the principles of freedom, equality, and reason were worth every risk, every personal discomfort, and every sleepless night. Franklin's letters reveal a man acutely aware of his place in history, but also one who remained human, vulnerable to doubt, weariness, and longing for home. He embodied the tension of revolution itself, the simultaneous exhilaration and terror of stepping into the unknown. As the American colonies trembled on the edge of rebellion, Franklin's actions, both public and private, became the invisible currents guiding the course of history. And while battles would be fought and alliances tested, one question lingered. In the air, as persistent as the scent of candle smoke in his study, could this audacious vision of liberty truly survive the tempests of human ambition and the tides of empire? As the years passed and the din of war faded into the uneasy calm of peace, Benjamin Franklin found himself at a crossroads where the public stage and the private world intertwined, where the echoes of history whispered in every corridor of Philadelphia and every salon of Paris. Sit back, relax, and picture Franklin in his final decade, his body weathered by gout, kidney stones, and the slow march of age, yet his mind still sharp, probing, and endlessly curious. Some historians suggest that these years revealed the truest form of Franklin's genius, the ability to reconcile personal frailty with immense public responsibility. Others believe it was in these quiet moments, away from the pomp of diplomacy, that he truly contemplated the consequences of his lifetime's work. Imagine him leaning over a desk cluttered with letters, treaties, and books. The soft scratching of his pen, the only sound in the room except for the occasional murmur of his grandson or the rustle of papers. His thoughts turned constantly to the young nation he had helped birth, to the Constitution now guiding its fragile democracy, and to the moral obligations that came with freedom. Franklin's advocacy against slavery during these twilight years was not just political, it was deeply personal, a reflection of a lifetime spent pondering the paradoxes of human nature and the gap between ideals and practice. Some researchers note that his late life letters reveal a man both reflective and pragmatic, aware of his own limitations, yet unwilling to abandon the fight for justice, for reason, and for the possibility of human improvement. Others suggest that Franklin's relationships in Paris, the flirtations, the friendships, and the playful, intellectual companionships were not mere diversions, but lifelines, reminders of the joy, curiosity, and beauty that still existed in Saranshim. In my imagination, the world seems to pause. The world seems to pause. The flirtations, the friendships, and the friendships, and the playful intellectual companionships were not mere diversions, but lifelines, the world he had helped shape. From the clatter of chess pieces in his parlor to the laughter and astonishment at the first Montgolfier balloon flights, Franklin continued to explore, invent, and observe, always seeking to understand how the world worked and how it might work better. And yet, beneath the activity, there was an undeniable awareness of mortality, a slow, inevitable pull toward the end. His final years were filled with quiet heroism, attending to the fledgling institutions of the nation, mentoring younger minds, and leaving behind a vision for what America might become. As he lay in his final days, breathing with difficulty, surrounded by family and the tools of a life devoted to reason, science, and liberty, Franklin's story reached its human apex not in a single dramatic act, but in the accumulated weight of decades spent shaping the possible from the impossible. And as he closed his eyes for the last time on April 17, 1790, one can't help but wonder, what did he see in the rising sun of a nation he helped create, and how much of his own spirit lingered in the world he left behind? Benjamin Franklin's death on the 17th of April, 1790, at the age of 84, was not merely the passing of a man, but the closing of a chapter that had reshaped a continent and, in many ways, the modern world itself. Sit back and let the scene settle in your mind. Philadelphia, the streets lined with tens of thousands of mourners, the air heavy with the tolling of church bells, flags at half-mast, and an entire city caught in the weight of grief and reflection. Some accounts suggest nearly half the population attended, stretching the funeral procession for blocks, a silent testament to a life that had touched countless lives in ways both seen and unseen. Across the Atlantic, the revolutionary government of France declared 3 days of mourning, honoring a man whose diplomacy had altered the course of their own history and whose charm had once captivated the salons of Paris. Researchers note that Franklin's legacy cannot be captured in monuments alone, or in the $100 bill that bears his face, but in the ideas and institutions he nurtured: the first public libraries, volunteer fire departments, hospitals, and secular universities, all manifestations of his belief that ordinary citizens working together could solve extraordinary problems. Some suggest that his scientific contributions, most famously the lightning rod, his mapping of the Gulf Stream, and the principles of electricity, are main emblematic of a mind perpetually probing the unseen forces that shape our world. Yet Franklin's life was not without its contradictions, and perhaps it is in these complexities that his humanity becomes most vivid. A man who once owned slaves, yet later became a passionate abolitionist, a devoted family man whose prolonged absences complicated his relationships, a diplomat and politician as calculating as he was genial, a scientist and inventor driven as much by curiosity as by public service. His writings, from Poor Richard's Almanac to his ever-unfinished autobiography, continue to resonate, offering aphorisms, humor, and wisdom that transcend centuries. Some historians argue that Franklin's greatest invention was not the bifocals or the lightning rod, but the idea of the self-made individual, capable of shaping both destiny and society through intellect, effort, and moral reflection. And as we reflect on the long shadow he cast over history, it becomes clear that Franklin's true achievement was more than political or scientific, it was philosophical. He demonstrated that a single life, when lived with curiosity, courage, and reason, could ripple across generations, leaving echoes that continue to shape the possibilities of freedom, knowledge, and human potential. So as you drift into the quiet of sleep, imagine his story like a candle flickering across the centuries, a life lived fully, a mind unbound, and a reminder that even in the softest whispers of history, some figures never fade, they illuminate the path forward.